Gary Hall is Professor of Media and Performing Arts, Director of the Center for Disruptive Media at Coventry University, United Kingdom, and Visiting Professor at the Hybrid Publishing Lab, Leuphana Incubator from Leuphana University, Germany. His publications include, as author, Culture in Bits, and digitized his book, The Politics of New Media, or Why We Need Open Access Now. As co-editor, he has New Cultural Studies, Adventures in Theory, and Experimenting Essays with Samuel Weber. His work has appeared in numerous journals, including Cultural Studies, the Oxford Literary Review, Parallax, and Radical Philosophy. He co-founded Culture Machine in 1999 and Open Humanities Press in 2006. So his presentation is entitled, What are the Digital Post-Humanities, Open Access and Pirate Philosophy?
See if I can see that there. Okay. All right, everyone. Oh, wow. Yeah, I thought those speakers were big. Yeah, they are, aren't they? Okay, all right. I don't need to ask you if you can all hear me. Yeah, you definitely can. Thanks so much for inviting me and hosting me so well, and to Annabella and Mercia and Katrina and Ricardo. The first thing I need to say is I'm going to try, on the one hand, I'm going to try and be quick because I know we're a bit behind time. On the other hand, I'm going to try and talk slowly so if everyone can follow. However, if you think it would help, there's a copy of this talk also on my website. So if you go to my website and the third button along on the top, which is Open Humanities Notebook, and you scroll down, there's a kind of version of this. So if that helps anyone to follow this, that would be all great. Okay, so my invitation invited me to speak about open access in relation to my work as a so-called open access activist, my work on open access books, and a so-called pirate philosophy. And I guess one of the questions that I'm interested in around these subjects relating to the themes of the conference is, what do emergent publication modes such as digital and multimedia and non-textual outputs, what do they mean for our ways of living and working and thinking and acting as researchers and academics and philosophers? So in the spirit of this conference's concern with the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, I thought I'd begin by looking at a digital humanities project that I've been involved with since 2011. And this is a project funded by JISC in the UK, and it's called Living Books About Life, and is a series of open access books about life, with life understood both philosophically and biologically. They provide multiple points of interrogation and contestation, as well as connection between the humanities and the sciences. So the 24 books that currently make up the series have been created by a globally distributed network of artists and theorists and philosophers. And what the books do is they repackage existing open access science-related research content from repositories that I'm sure most of you know about, such as Archive and PLOS and PubMed Central, by clustering it around selected topics to form a series of coherent, single-themed volumes. So you've got volumes on things like bioethics and biosemiotics and cognition and evolution and so on. And by initially creating 21 of these living books about life in just 7 months, the series, which is edited by Claire Burchill, Joanna Zielinska and myself, offers one model for publishing digital humanities books in a low-cost manner in the future. Many of us associated with the series have been advocating for open access for some time now. But what we're trying to do with the Living Books project is do more than that, just more than just lobby for open access. We're trying to take 20 or more humanities scholars who are not necessarily familiar with open access and actively engage them in publishing in this fashion. So what we do is we start the process of creating each book by asking the editors to select a minimum of 10 science-related articles on their chosen theme. So this one's astrobiology, as you can see. And they're choosing that from the existing open access science-related research content. And this can be previously published material from peer-reviewed open access journals or self-archiving repositories. And we stipulate a minimum of 10 such science-related articles, although most of the editors actually exceeded that, just to ensure that the majority of each book is made up of content that's already been peer-reviewed and is available under the appropriate Creative Commons licenses. However, once the editors have these 10 articles, this content is then supplemented with additional material. So it can be other articles that are not science-related, it can be podcasts, it can be visualizations, interactive maps, audio, visual material from YouTube and so on. And then each editor is asked to write an opening essay that just links the volume's content together and provides a point of connection and translation between the two cultures, between the humanities and the sciences. And as I say, the majority of each book is made up of content, open access content that's already been peer reviewed. Nonetheless, the project team arranged for peer review of each book in line with standard editorial practice in the humanities. And the team also copy, edit, and proof and format the books and provide front and back cover pages, assign ISBN numbers, and create a PDF version of how each book initially stands. The books are then published on an open source wiki and a blog using open source software, so MediaWiki by Wikimedia. And one of the most important aspects of the Living Books series, for us anyway, is the impact it has on the researchers who take part. To begin with, it has to be said there's a generally low level of knowledge among most of our chosen humanities-based editors regarding publishing open access and the restrictions that are often placed on academic publishings by publishers' licensing and copyright agreements. It quickly became to us when we were working on the project that the majority of academics still require guidance regarding these issues. For example, it took some of our editors quite a bit of time to realise that while they might be able to openly access a given article from their computer at work because their institution has taken out a subscription to a particular journal or to JSTOR or Project Muse, other people whose institution hasn't taken out such a subscription or who are not affiliated even to an institution at all might not be able to access that article online at all. So that's one problem. There's also a need to clarify the difference between open access articles that are made available under Creative Commons licenses that do allow others to copy and reuse and distribute and display them publicly and make derivative works, and articles with proprietary licenses that have been made available open access in repositories such as PubMed, but which are not available for reuse, and that can only be made accessible via a direct link. And that latter understanding is important because one of our main motivations behind the Living Book series is the desire to experiment with publishing a book not just gratis or free open access, but on a Libra or reuse basis too. After all, the Budapest, Bethesda, Berlin definition of open access, which is one of the major agreements that underlies the movement, that lists the ability to reuse material as one of open access's essential features. Yet what our research shows is that of the books that are presently available open access, only a minority have a license where price and permission barriers to research are removed. So by contrast, the books in our series are not just freely available for anyone anywhere to read and comment on. These living books about life are open on a read-write basis. And so users can help to compose and edit and annotate and remix them. So anyone can get involved. It's just an example from a sister series called Liquid Books. So anyone can get involved in the process of creating these books or in adapting the existing books that we've produced for use in e-learning, for example, and this way produce an alternative open educational resource where the content and form of the book can be negotiated, updated, and altered by learners themselves. Now, just going to skip through a little bit. There we go. Now, given that many of the ideas in which the humanities, and with them, in fact, the university, are based, I'm thinking the individualised author, originality, fixity, the finished object, the signature, and so on. Given that all those ideas are commonly held as a means of sustaining authority and creating trust between the author and reader, why would we want to put all this at risk by making the Books Now series available on an open read-write basis? Why would we want to allow people to be able to mess around with these texts? And one way to explain this, as my title suggests, is in terms of digital post-humanities. Now, our interest in this idea of the post-humanities, goes at least as far back as 2006. And the chapter on cultural studies in the post-humanities, Claire Birchall and I asked Neil Badminton to write for a book called New Cultural Studies. And as this reference to Neil Badminton suggests, the idea of digital post-humanities is a development of research conducted not just in the digital humanities, but also under the sign of what's called the post-human. However, it's also a departure from much of this research. So what I'm going to do for a few minutes now is I'm going to try and explain exactly how and why. And I'm going to do that by turning to a recent book by the philosopher Rosie Braidotti there. So as you can see, it's called precisely The Post-Human. Now, there's going to be a few minutes of philosophy and theory here. I've been told that philosophy runs throughout the curriculum here, and so you're all up for this. So this is good. But if anyone does want to just, check their email or tweet or do whatever you want to do, it's fine. I won't take it personally. It's all okay. But no one's been killed by a bit of philosophy yet. No, not mine anyway. So it'll be all right in the end, okay? I promise you we'll get through this. Okay, so posthumanism. It's concerned with the displacement of the unified humanist subject from its central place in the world. And that's come about as a result of the erosion of man's natural boundaries with the animal, with technology, and the environment. So from this starting point, Braidotti identifies one of the main questions that she wants to address in this book is how does that notion of the post-human affect the practice of the humanities today? And more specifically, what is the function of theory and philosophy in post-human times? If man is not the centre of the world anymore, what does that do to our notion of the humanities? And for her, the task of theory and philosophy is to provide adequate representations of our situated historical location. And this is tied up with the notions that the boundaries between the categories of the natural and the cultural have been displaced in post-human times by the effects of scientific and technological advances, such as those associated with robotics and prosthetics and reproductive technologies. So Braidotti's book comes from a starting point where she's assuming a change of paradigm. She's moving from a social constructivist approach, and that posits a distinction between the given nature and the constructed culture. So this idea that nature's just there, it's given, we can't do anything about it, but all our culture is kind of, we shape our culture. So we've shifted from that to a monistic philosophy. And she's using philosophers such as Spinoza and Bergson and Deleuze and Guattari. And that's rejecting that kind of social constructive dualism, and especially that opposition between nature and culture, and instead stressing the self-organizing or auto-poetic force of living matter. Hang on in there, it'll be all right. So, among Braidotti's methodological guidelines for post-human critical thought are, first, what she calls cartographic accuracy. It's kind of a mapping, which aims at ethical accountability by unveiling the power locations which structure our subject position. Remember, I started by saying I wanted to think about, what all this does for us and when we're speaking. Second, that this kind of critiques of power locations should work alongside the search for creative alternative figures or conceptual persona for these locations. She wants figures that's going to express representations of the post-human subject as a dynamic, non-unitary identity and dramatises this kind of processes of becoming. So it's not fixed, it's always in the process of becoming, taking shape. And so the examples she gives are the feminist, the queer, the cyborg, diasporic, native, nomadic subjects, as well as Onko Mouse and Dolly the sheep here. And her third criteria is the adoption of a zigzagging, non-linear thinking in response to the complexity of contemporary science and the fact that the global economy does not function in a linear manner, but is rather web-like, scattered, and polycentered. Do you want this? I'm just going to change it. I'll take a drink while you take a photo of that one. That's a nice one, isn't it? It's okay? I can carry on? All right. So Braidotti proceeds to propose a number of criteria for a new post-human ethics capable of generating the conditions for renewed political and ethical energy in the Anthropocene era. And these criteria, and you've got to remember them because I'm going to come back to them endlessly. So these criteria include non-profit, emphasis on the collective, experimenting with and actualizing potential or virtual options, and a new link between theory and practice, including a central role for creativity. At the same time, she argues that the contemporary university needs to redefine its mission. And the key words here are open source, open governance, open data, and open science. Now, what makes Braidotti's book so exciting is the way she's clearly opening the door here for a radical change, a radical transformation of many of the ideas in which the humanities are based. So you've got the human subject as a unitary identity, you've got the individualized proprietary author, the linear rational argument, and so on. So she seems to be calling for a profound transformation in our ways of life, our ways of living, acting, working, and thinking as academics and researchers and theorists and philosophers. Now, if you noticed, I said seems there because Braidotti can also be seen to be keeping this door barely ajar, if not actively shutting it again. You can see the emphasis she places on affirmative alternative to dominant representations of the self, on non-profit, on collectivity, on open source and open science. That's rather undercut by the fact Braidotti has not actually published her book on a non-profit basis, but she's published it with Polity Press. And although an independent, as you can see, Polity are a for-profit that distribute the post-human through John Wiley, who, along with Reed Elsevier and Springer and Taylor and Francis Informer, are one of the big four profit-maximising publishing mega corporations. Nor has Braidotti made the post-human available to others for sharing and reuse on an open source or open access basis. In fact, far from her methodology not being about the authority of a proper noun, a signature, as she puts it at one point, the post-human very much functions to help certain established ways of being to persist. And these include those associated with the construct known as Braidotti, the internationally renowned theorist. A construct that is perhaps as different from Braidotti as, according to Bruno Latour, Pasteur, the great researcher, was from the scientists composed of those elements that formed the Pasteur network, many of them objects in non-humans such as microbes and networks and laboratories and vaccinated cows. But the post-human also helps to sustain the sense of Braidotti as an identifiable, self-contained individual human whose subjectivity is static and stable enough for her to be able to sign her name on a contract, giving her the legal right to assert her identity as the author of the work and to claim this original, fixed and final version of the text as her isolable intellectual property, not least, as you can see, by an all rights reserved copyright notice. So when it comes to how she performs her role and identity as an academic author of post-human critical theory, rather than being actually involved in the active pursuit of affirmative alternatives to the dominant vision of the subject, we can see Braidotti is in many respects still operating according to the Enlightenment model of the individual liberal humanist subject as citizen, as rights holder, and as property holder. Now, I hope this is more than just me making a cheap shot. I mean, it's me making a cheap shot, but I hope it's a bit more than that. It's something that Braidotti has in common not only with most of those who are associated with the humanities, but those associated with the post-human too. While the human's boundaries with the animal, the technology and the environment may all be eroded in post-humanist discourses, one dividing line tends to be kept intact, and that's between the humanities and any possible post-humanities. So if we take the well-known post-humanities series by Carrie Wolf, which was launched in 2007, now I have to say I really like this series. I think its vision of post-human theories, moving beyond the standard parameters and practices of the humanities, I think it's really exciting. The question is, how does this square with the fact that what this series has produced in the main is yet more specialist, linearly structured, book-length studies published by individual academic authors as original, fixed and final monographs in uniform, multiple copy editions on an all rights reserved basis, copyright of the Regents of the University of Minnesota. Now, there are, of course, perfectly understandable reasons why Braidotti and Wolf and others might have taken the decision not to create, publish and circulate their research in a collective, free and open manner, and for the most part adhered to the established forms and methods of the humanities. As Braidotti points out with regard to another of her methodological guidelines for post-human theory, disidentification, say from the dominant institutions and their normative representations of the author, of originality, of how particular persons of power and influence emerge. Disidentification can be highly destabilizing, as it involves the loss of cherished habits of thought and representation, which can also produce fear and insecurity and nostalgia. When it comes to methodology, it requires disidentification from century-old habits of anthropocentric thought and humanist arrogance, including, we'd argue, those associated with monographs and journals and conferences and research groups and so on. For example, Braidotti tells us that the alternative processes of becoming, which those conceptual personae I talked about earlier, such as the feminist and the queer and the cyborg, dramatise, she argues that they defy the established modes of theoretical representation because they are zigzagging and not linear, and they're process-oriented, not concept-driven. Yet any rhizomatic or non-linear process-oriented methodology adopted by post-human critical theorists or researchers would similarly defy the established modes of asserting copyright. And this is because of a distinction in our particular political economy, not every political economy, but our particular political economy, between the process of making and the finished object that is made. As the anthropologist James Leach emphasises in an article on the politics of making knowledge objects, one cannot own a distinctive form of creative practice, only the expressions of that practice. As a consequence, all too often policy and precedent focus on the object and its value to the detriment of the processes whereby wider social value and benefit is created. So all those wider processes that Pedro was talking about and raising that would go into the production of a text. And this is also the case with regard to knowledge created in universities. Here too, as Leach points out, a recurrent theme emerges whereby the emphasis for claims, for calculating recompense, locates value not in the processes of production, but in the production of things, finished objects. Books, for example, for which the author of the work, as established in copyright law, can claim recompense and accrue value, recognition, advancement, prestige, because we can kind of measure them and assess them and look at the impact and all the things we've been talking about. So ideas such as the identifiable proprietary author, the signature, originality, copyright, may be a means of credentialing authority and creating trust between the author and the reader. But as Janneke Adema reveals in her research on the history of the scholarly book, building on that of the historian Adrian Jones, it was precisely the conventions related to proprietary and trust developed by publishers in the 18th century as protection against piracy and impropriety that were also used to turn the book into a scholarly object and commercial commodity. So, to adopt a methodology conceptualized within a monastic ontology that does indeed focus more on the multifaceted and relational processes of making and becoming would involve post-human critical theory in raising questions that would be profoundly destabilizing on a number of accounts. It'd be destabilizing for the capitalist economy's commodification of knowledge and the way value here lies in objects, sites, or codifiable or static practices. Hence all the emphasis in university today that we've been talking about on knowledge that can be objectified and thus measured, audited, used, transferred. It would be destabilising for conventional ideas of open data and open access, since such research in post-human critical theory would be understood not so much as an object to which free, gratis access can be given, but as a process that universities teach and to which, as we've seen with the development of open education and open science, free access, contrary to Robin Osborne here, can be given. But it would also be destabilising for many of the ideas on which the humanities are based and which shape how we live and work and think as academics and researchers and philosophers, including how our subjectivities are created and maintained. None of this is to deny that our research cannot only be processual and that it has to be an academic or commodifiable object or site or practice to some degree, at least if we are to make it available on an open access or open education basis, or to continue to operate effectively within the institution of the university. One can imagine part of Braidotti's aim in writing this more introductory book is to open up ideas of the post-human to a wider audience, in which case for her to have actually assumed her ideas about non-profitability and the collective and open source and so on might well have put this strategy at risk. Publishing on such a basis might not have had the same status as publishing all rights reserved with a for-profit print press. It would thus not have fitted so well with the protocols of recognition in the humanities and how one achieves power and influence, and this often has an effect. So we have to work strategically in particular contingent contexts and make the best or least worst decisions or cuts that we can. But hopefully what all this does do is draw attention to some of the decisions that have been made and some of the different, perhaps more responsible decisions that are possible. Decisions that might enable us to critique certain forms of humanism and the humanities and creatively attempt other alternative ways of being as academics, theorists and philosophers, ways that we might begin to think of as post-humanities. So in this respect, any such post-humanities wouldn't represent an attempt to radically overcome humanism as an intellectual tradition and institutionalized practice, which is the way Braidotti describes the possibility. The post-humanities would be more of a mutation or intensification of elements, dynamics, and potentials that are already present in the humanities. So it's not necessarily an either-or choice, humanities or post-humanities. As the success of Open Humanities Press and other open access publishers shows, one can publish a quite traditional, linear-structured, book-length study and still make it available open source and open access using things like open monograph press software and Creative Commons licenses. There are even ways of doing so with a book published by a brand name, for-profit, print-on-paper-only press, such as making a so-called pirate copy available on a text-sharing network like ARG here. This is why, to the list of alternative conceptual personae or figures, the feminist, the cyborg, and so on, we'd want to add that of the pirate. Although when we're saying that, we're thinking not of the romantic outsider of film and fiction, we're not thinking Johnny Depp. We're going back to the etymological origins of the term. When the word pirate began to appear in the text of the ancient Greeks, you can see right at the top there in tiny writing, it was closely related to the noun for trial or attempt. So the pirate here is one who tests, who puts to the proof, contends with, and makes an attempt. He's also the one who teases as well, but you know. So examples such as arg.org and the Pirate Project show art can be one place where assumptions about property and propriety can be contended with and tested via an emphasis on non-profit and collectivity and process especially. But thanks in part to e-publishing and e-learning and the digital humanities, we think even the more conventional disciplinary formations of critical theory and philosophy have the potential to offer such a space too. And this is in spite of the way people like Zizek and Roncière and Badiou and others appear intent on returning us to a period of phallogocentric emphasis, to borrow Helena Sisu's words, something that's heavily masculine and devoid of imagination. All that really is a long-winded way of explaining why we are prepared to put many of the ideas in which the humanities are based at risk by making the books in the Living Book series available on an open read-write basis. In keeping with this pirate philosophy, and under the guise of what can be thought of as a digital post-humanities, we're trying to critically and creatively test and trial and tease and trouble some of these ideas, rather than being, like Braidotti, continually dragged back towards the humanities. So as well as repackaging the available open access science material on life into a series of books, we can thus see this series as engaging in rethinking the book itself as a living, collaborative, non-profit, processual endeavour. After all, as Braidotti writes at one point, only a serious mutation can help the humanities grow out of some of their entrenched habits. But hopefully all this also explains why, when it comes to Open Humanities Press, of which the Living Book series is part and which I co-founded and helped run, all this explains why, when it comes to Open Humanities Press, we're experimenting with working on a non-profit basis. So all our books and journals are available open access on a free, gratis basis, and many of them Libre too. We're using open source software for our journals, generally either Open Journal Systems or WordPress. We operate as a collective of scholars, librarians, philosophers, publishers, technologists, and so on. We're gifting our labour rather than insisting on being paid for it. And we're working horizontally in a non-rivalrous fashion. So we freely share our knowledge and our expertise and even the publications that we produce with other open access publishers, such as Open Book Publishers in Cambridge and Open Edition in France, and the Hybrid Publishing Lab at Leuphana in Germany. Okay, I will end there. Thank you very much for listening. Appreciate it.